Find a private cadre of advisors who have no axes to grind. Call your mom. Over the next few months I would have liked more advice from Dick, but there was a very watchful group of people at IBM waiting to see if I was setting him up as my own force behind the throne. I didn't want to do that to him or to me. We talked several times, but briefly, and not with the impact his first meeting had on me and the company. On April 13 I interviewed Jerry York at IBM's office in New York City. Jerry was then Chief Financial Officer at Chrysler Corporation, and was one of 2 candidates I was seeing that week for the CFO job. It was a truly memorable interview. Jerry arrived in a starched white shirt and a blue suit, everything crisp and perfect, West Point style. He was not coy and did not pull any punches. He basically said he wanted the job and then proceeded to outline a series of things that he thought needed to be done as soon as possible. I was impressed by his frankness, his lack of guile, and his candor, as well as his analytical capabilities. It was clear to me that he was tough, very tough, and just what I needed to get at the cost side of IBM. I spoke to another candidate later that week, but I decided Jerry was the right person. He joined us on May 10. I also saw Jerry Zarnecki, a candidate for the HR job. Jerry was an operations executive at a bank but had been an HR professional years before. Over the next couple of weeks we met several times, both by phone and in person. Although I liked Jerry's energy and his directness, I wasn't certain he was prepared to go back into the HR function. He said, probably not anywhere else, but to be part of the turnaround of IBM, I'm prepared to do it. That turned out to be one of the few hirings that didn't work out as planned during my early years at IBM. It soon became clear to me that it was proving very hard for Jerry to go back and lead the professional HR community. Within 4 months he appeared to be acting and sounding more like a vice CEO. It wasn't that Jerry's ideas were wrong, in fact, he was a major proponent of substantial cultural change. However, the organization wasn't going to accept from Jerry what it would accept from me. He burned his bridges with his colleagues very soon and he left IBM within a year of his hiring. Of course, my top priority during those first few weeks was meeting privately with each of the senior executives. A few of them had prepared the 10-page briefing I had requested, most of them offered a more ad hoc analysis of their businesses. In all the meetings over those several weeks, I was sizing up my team, trying to understand the problems they faced and how they were dealing with them, how clearly they thought, how well they executed, and what their leadership potential really was. The person I relied on most during those early days was Paul Rizzo. As I said earlier, he had been called back from retirement by the board to help John Akers. Paul had been a senior executive at IBM for 22 years. After retiring, he became dean of the business school at the University of North Carolina and was building a new house in that state. The last thing he needed was to come back to IBM, but he did because he loved the company and he didn't want to see it die. When I arrived, Paul was responsible for the program of federalism, breaking up the company into individual, autonomous units. Not that Paul created the strategy, but in the absence of a CFO, he was basically overseeing the finance function for the board. He was also in charge of watching all the investment bankers who were scrambling over most parts of the company, dollar signs in their eyes as they planted their flags into each business unit. It reminded me of a gold rush. Each one saw an initial public offering of stock, IPO, for the unit or units that he or she advised. We were spending tens of millions of dollars on accountants to create the bookkeeping required for IPOs because IBM's financial system did not support standalone units. Paul was also deeply involved in the financing activities that were underway to raise additional capital. For me, asking Paul to stay on was an easy decision, and I'm grateful he did. Over the next year he was a tower of strength, a wise mentor, and an insightful partner in evaluating strategy and people, another important hero of the IBM turnaround. A special moment occurred during those first weeks of April. I walked out of my home one morning at my usual early hour. However, when I opened my car door, I suddenly realized there was someone sitting in the back seat. It was Thomas J. Watson, Jr., former IBM CEO and the son of IBM's founder. Tom literally lived across the street and had walked up my driveway to surprise me and ride to work with me. He was 79 years old, and he had retired as CEO of IBM in 1971. He was animated and, perhaps better stated, agitated. He said he was angry about what had happened to my company. He said I needed to shake it up from top to bottom and to take whatever steps were necessary to get it back on track. He offered support, urged me to move quickly, reflected on his own career, and, in particular, the need he had seen over and over again to take bold action. At the end of our ride together, I had the feeling he wished he could take on the assignment himself. On April 15 I made my first official visit to a non-headquarters site. I had chosen it carefully, the company's research laboratory in Yorktown Heights, New York. If there was a soul of IBM, this lab was it. Appropriately named the T.J. Watson Research Center, it contained the intellectual fervor that had led IBM over decades to invent most of the important developments that had created the computer industry. It was my first public appearance inside IBM, and it was important because I knew this was my greatest immediate vulnerability. Would the researchers reject me as an unacceptable leader? Some in the company were calling me the Cookie Monster because of my previous job at Nabisco. I spoke from a stage in an auditorium. The house was full, and my remarks were broadcast to an overflow of employees in the cafeteria. Other IBM research facilities around the world picked up the broadcast as well. The stereotype of researchers says they are so focused on big ideas that they are disconnected from the real world. Well, not these researchers. I saw the pain of IBM's problems on their faces. I don't know if they were curious or apprehensive, but they certainly came to listen. I gave what soon became my stump speech on focus, speed, customers, teamwork, and getting all the pain behind us. I talked about how proud I was to be at IBM. I underscored the importance of research to IBM's future, but I said we probably needed to figure out ways to get our customers and our researchers closer together so that more of IBM's great foundry of innovation would be aimed at helping people solve real and pressing problems. There was applause, but I wasn't sure what they were thinking. The shareholders' meeting, perhaps the most traumatic event of my first month at IBM, was the annual shareholders' meeting. It had been scheduled, I'm sure, several years in advance for April 26 in Tampa, Florida. Needless to say, it was a daunting challenge to chair my first shareholders meeting when the company had such major and visible problems. I had been there for only 3 weeks, could barely identify the products, let alone explain what they did, or, God forbid, describe the technologies inside them. Moreover, it was clear IBM's shareholders were angry and out for blood, perhaps deservedly so. IBM stock had dropped from a high of $43 a share in 1987 to $12 a share the day of the shareholders' meeting. That was less than half its price. At the previous year's meeting, there were 2,300 shareholders waiting impatiently for the show to start when I walked out onto the stage at 10 a.m. that day, in the biggest convention hall I had ever seen. You couldn't help but notice a sea of white hair. Obviously, a lot of retirees in Florida owned IBM stock. I made a brief speech in which I asked for some patience, but I made it clear that I was going to move quickly, make all changes necessary, and return the company's focus to the customer. I got polite applause, and then the fireworks started. Shareholder after shareholder stood up and blasted the company, and frequently the board of directors, all of whom were sitting in front of me in the first row of the auditorium. It was a massacre. The directors took direct hit after direct hit. The shareholders were reasonably kind to me in terms of not holding me accountable for the problems, but they also showed little patience for anything other than a fast recovery. It was a long, exhausting meeting, for everyone, I think. I remember flying back to New York alone that evening on an IBM corporate airplane. My thoughts turned to the board of directors. It was clear from the annual meeting that board changes would be necessary, and sooner rather than later. I turned to the flight attendant and said, "This has been a really tough day. I think I'd like to have a drink." She said, "You don't mean an alcoholic drink, do you?" "I certainly do," I replied. "What kind of vodka do you have?" "We have no alcohol on IBM airplanes. It is prohibited to serve alcohol." I said, "Can you think of anyone who could change that rule?" "Well, perhaps you could, sir. It's changed, effective immediately." Out to the field. It was crucial that I get out into the field. I didn't want my understanding of the company to be based on the impressions of headquarters employees. Moreover, the local IBM princes and barons were eager to view the new leader. So the day after the annual meeting, I flew to France to meet with the mightiest of all nobles, IBM Europe, Middle East, and Africa, we call it EMEA. I visited France, Italy, Germany, and the United Kingdom, all in 1 week.